Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation on the Synoptic Gospels. So, the Synoptic Gospels, which include the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. With that, there's the idea of the Synoptic problem. And the Synoptic problem is essentially, how do we account for the differences and the similarities, because a lot of them are similar, but then also how do we account for the differences between these three Gospels? So we're asking questions like, what order were the Gospels written, which Gospel was written first, and what are the relationships between these three Gospels? So the first thing I want to point out is Markan priority, which is the belief that the book of Mark was written first. And this is the most widely held belief, the most popular and common belief. So some evidence that we have for this is that 90% of Mark is found in both Matthew and Luke, suggesting they're kind of abbreviating the book of Mark. Another thing we see is that the language found in Mark is a bit more of a rougher Greek, and there's some words that could be a bit more harsh or offensive. So we see Luke and Matthew kind of smooth this language over. For example, Mark 1:12 says, the Spirit immediately drove him into wilderness. So the word drove is a bit harsh, and we see that in the book of Matthew and Luke. They changed this word to led because it's a bit less harsh. So another thing that I kind of want to point out is the question of, if we have this source for Matthew and Luke is Mark, then what about the differences? Like, what is the source that we get the differences of why Luke and Matthew have things that Mark doesn't have? So what most scholars believe is there's this source, and they like to call the source Q. So if we get a lot of the deeds from Mark, this is the source for the deeds in Matthew and Luke, then what about the sayings that we see Jesus say in these books? Well, most scholars believe that we get these sayings from this source, which they've termed as Q. They believe it could be a single source, or it could be multiple sources, or like a community of sources. But essentially they believe that this is where we get a lot of Jesus' sayings. So the next thing I want to say is that we should, take this as it is a theory, and it does kind of seem like the best explanation. However, it is a theory, and there is not one solution that explains everything. All right. The next thing I want to touch on is the differences in the styles of the four different Gospels. So first, the book of Matthew. Who is this primarily written to? Or it's primarily written to the Jews. We see him emphasize Jesus as the King of Israel, as the sacrificed Son of God. He begins with the genealogies in a way that's intended to connect the Old Testament God to Jesus. Next, we have Mark, and we believe he primarily writes this gospel to the Romans. We see this in his emphasis on the miracles, the actions of Jesus, how powerful he was, in a way that's intended to almost like impress the Romans. Okay, next we have Luke. Luke is a physician. He writes in this beautiful, kind of eloquent detail. And we believe that Luke writes for the Greeks. Luke is very scientific. He gives us a very in-depth kind of physician's perspective on the diseases and the healings and stuff. So then, last but not least, certainly, we have John. We actually believe that John wrote his gospel for all men, for everyone in the world. John has this kind of the loving spirit. We also see this fiery passion kind of throughout his writings. He really emphasizes the divine nature of Jesus, and he also a lot of times emphasizes the work of the Holy Spirit throughout his gospel. So I want to kind of conclude with kind of the question of why four gospels, and the reasoning is, all these Gospels present essentially a different angle and a different perspective of Jesus and different aspects of who he was and his life and his words and actions and teachings. And so with the four of them, we kind of are left with this wholeness, this beautiful picture of who he was, the whole story of the gospel, but we're able to get so many different kind of snapshots of who Jesus is and what his life was like. So yeah, thanks for watching.